Children are largely being ignored in the AIDS epidemic. That's the word from the UN and several organizations uniting today to launch a global campaign. Bill Roedy is the UN AIDS Goodwill Ambassador and president of MTV Networks, and he joins us now to talk about how media organizations can help support the global fight against AIDS. Bill, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So the concern is that organizations and governments are ignoring children in this AIDS epidemic or pandemic. But is it an ignoring, or is this simply an oversight?
Oh, I think it's an oversight. I mean, there's so much clutter. I mean, just watching your news with the hurricanes and Iraq and everything else, I think there's just so much going on. It's hard to stay focused. And, I know people tend to glaze over on the numbers, but this is a 25-year-old epidemic. There are 15 million orphans. And I know people can't relate to 15 million orphans, but you can relate to this. While we're talking, one child will have died. One child dies every single minute. So, ironically, children have been left out of this largely, and they really should be the focus, and that was the purpose of today's announcement. This is uniting against AIDS and uniting for children.
And that announcement is what? What is this campaign going to do?
Well, there's a bunch of things. There's a whole list of things. My involvement actually is as head of the GMAI, which is a global media AIDS initiative. This was launched by the Secretary General last year, and our main initiative is to get every media company around the world, including CNN, to sign up to 5 pledges. And the 2 most important pledges, I think, are devoting at least 1 minute every night in prime time to an AIDS message. It doesn't sound like a lot, but if everyone did it, it could have an immeasurable impact. And then secondly, making that programming rights-free so every broadcaster, every media outlet can have access to it.
Who are these children? We're looking at these pictures, and it's so hard to see. But who are these children? Are these children who have AIDS? Are they children who are born with the disease? Are they children who are sexually active?
Well, no, not sexually active, the kids obviously you're seeing now. This is primarily from Africa. Africa continues to be the hardest hit, but the epicenter is moving. It is moving to India and China and Russia and Eastern Europe. But AIDS knows no boundaries. It's everywhere in the world. And AIDS redefines childhood. And the thing about children is that we were all once children. So
right.
We can all relate to this. We can all relate to orphans. We can all relate to how vulnerable children are.
We hear this and we know the stats, but at what point do people reach deep into their pockets and give?
Well, again, ironically, the money, the financial resources in the 25-year history of this epidemic have never been better. It's a matter of getting efficient use of that money, and it's a matter of getting ROI, if you will, a business relationship to our efforts to fight the epidemic. People are reaching, and media companies are doing their part as well. It's not enough, and we need to do much, much more, but I've actually never felt better about the response toward the epidemic than I have now. Not to say that it's over, because our work is very much ahead of us, but the response has actually been much better than it ever has been.
Well, good luck to your campaign, Bill Roedy. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Please welcome Bill Roedy, President of MTV International. Thank you very much for joining us. Look, Bill, you just heard from Tembi. You're talking about MTV. You're talking about trying to get these messages to young people. A, does it work? Can you reach the Tembis of the world? And B, how do you know that you're doing it? How do you measure it?
Well, by the way, music's great. Let's put them on MTV. Let me just set the record straight on that. Heavy rotation, I promise. Stigma. Stigma is really the insidious part of this disease. Nelson Mandela said that stigma is actually worse than a disease itself. And it constrains so much of our efforts here. It's not only politically and socially and religious constraints, but it fights everything we do, and we have to find a way to crack it, and we really haven't yet. We haven't found a way to crack it. I mean, Tembi is, what, 20, 19, 21? So you're in the sweet spot of our audience, and living with HIV is part of life now. It's part of life. It doesn't have to be a death sentence. It's very important to get these messages across and use role models, and the best sort of role model is Tembi.
Absolutely.
When Tembi talks about it, you can't beat that.
In just a few hours, those assembled for the UN's mega meeting will hear from the only person from the private sector scheduled to speak. Bill Roedy is chairman of the Global Media AIDS Initiative, as well as a UN AIDS ambassador. He joins us now live from New York with more on the media's role in this fight against AIDS. What are you going to tell the assembly?
Well, a couple things. One is that media has a big role to play here. You know, the UN has said 2/3 of all infections, new infections, can be stopped with proper education. And until there's a vaccine, education can actually be a vaccine. And further, the UN has also said that media can actually save more lives than doctors. Now, that's not to denigrate the medical field, obviously, but just to give you an idea that the power that media has, both in prevention and stigma. So that'll be one of my main messages, that media has to do much, much more. Secondly, I want to talk about testing, because everyone should be tested. There's two ways to do it, mandatory or voluntary. It should not be mandatory.
Why not?
It needs to be voluntary. Well, for a number of reasons. One, because we haven't cracked the stigma yet. So everyone should get tested, but it has to be voluntary, much more accessible, with confidentiality, of course, counseling and treatment wherever it's possible. And with those four criteria, I think testing would be much more successful. You know, the vast majority of people that are infected don't know they're infected, and that hurts not only prevention, but also treatment. So we do have to have much more testing.
All right, you're a UN AIDS ambassador. You're also the president of MTV Networks International, and you talk about the role the media can play in AIDS prevention. Specifically, what do you mean?
Well, there's a lot of things media can do, but very specifically, we have a charter. For example, we want everyone to sign up, all media companies. We now have 130 media companies, by the way, and many media companies have done a great job. But the charter should consist of a number of different activities. One is a very specific commitment to airtime, or if it's non-broadcast, whatever the inventory is. Very specific. On broadcast, you know, we have some television companies around the world devoting some of the MTV channels, for example, up to 5 minutes a day. It needs to be part of the DNA of every media company. It also needs to be produced rights-free. All the programming for prevention and stigma needs to be produced rights-free and made available to everyone, particularly those media companies that may not have the resources. It needs to be relevant messaging locally, and it needs to be done in partnership with other media companies. There's no competition here when it comes to fighting the epidemic.
Here's the question, Bill Roedy, though. Media companies are in the business of producing content to make money. How do you convince a media company to set aside airtime for what is essentially a public service message?
This is the most devastating epidemic in recorded history. It's also preventable and treatable. And the fact that we haven't gotten ahead of the numbers is really a tragedy. And media companies increasingly understand the role they have here. And not only the role, but the opportunity to make a difference. And we can save lives. You know, how many times have you heard about media being a force of good in the world? Well, in this case, media can actually be a force of good and save lives.
All right, Bill Roedy, thanks very much. Chairman of the Global Media AIDS Initiative, addressing the UN General Assembly at 5 p.m., I believe?
Thank you.
All
yes,
right.
yes, thank you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us on Your World Today.